Good morning, and firstly, thank you to Dr. Samir Saran and ORF for including us in this very important conversation. I can only hope that there'll be a DPI conclave every year at Raisina and in different parts of the world to take these conversations even further. But delighted to be sitting down with Ambassador Amandeep Gill. Amandeep, maybe I can just start with a broad question. Last 18 months have been busy for DPI. We've seen a lot of action. There was the Indian presidency of the G20. It electrified, I think, an entire ecosystem around DPI in many different ways. There is a market story around DPI that seems to be evolving pretty fast. So today you have the Foreign Secretary mentioned that this is about building transparent, auditable systems and not necessarily proprietary systems. But we've also seen traditional proprietary firms now take up the DPI agenda. How do you generally see the space evolve? And what are you mapping from your perch?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rudra. And thank you to Samir and the team for bringing us together. Now, it's been exciting and we've had some great developments. I would also put in that basket the universalization of the G20 consensus on DPIs through the adoption of the Global Digital Compact, which now kind of centers an inclusive digital economy on the international agenda, and DPIs play a prominent part in the text. For 2025, 2026, I see three important challenges. The first one is implementation, frankly, because all this progress will amount to not much if we don't take the DPI's thinking, the protection through the DPI Safeguards framework that we put together with UNDP, and I'm glad the Foreign Secretary mentioned human rights. So if we don't take these frameworks, these ways of thinking into more countries, into application on the ground, then we will run out of momentum. So implementation is the first point. The second one is I see trends around regionalization of DPIs. So take the EU's EIDAS, for example, or the thinking evolving in Eastern Africa on cross-border trade facilitation by riding on aspects of DPIs. I think this is a very important trend and we need to stoke it further so that we see connections not only in terms of inclusion and the build-up of the digital economy, but also the boost to intra-regional trade, which is vital to lift incomes in Africa, for example, in other parts of the world. The third trend I see is, you mentioned the private sector interest. I think there's a lot of focus now on AI, and it'll be important not to kind of, allow silos to form around DPIs and AI. Some of you have heard me say the short term and the long term start at the same time. So we shouldn't be thinking of DPIs related infrastructure issues today and AI related infrastructure issues tomorrow. There should be a combined thinking around this. So not to lose sight of the power of the DPI paradigm, but at the same time, implement it in a way that you are able to take advantage of the AI shift.
So maybe, Amandeep, I can just pick out one strand to start with, which is implementation. We've heard a lot about DPI. The ecosystem is vibrant, but I think as you also mentioned, there seemed to be some general friction when it comes to implementation. And instinctively you would say this is the right way to go when it comes to digital futures. I think, the facts are pretty clear. There's just not enough money in the system in the world to finance digital transformation the traditional way, or the way we've done it for the last 50 years. So DPI provides an alternative that is also perhaps the only alternative in many ways. What are the general frictions, if I can put you on the spot a little bit, is what are the general frictions to implementation?
That's a great question, Rudra. And this is from a grassroots perspective. The first friction in any context is, what's relevant in my context? What is it that I can use in terms of DPI experience of, say, India, Bangladesh, Estonia, or other geographies where this has been successfully deployed. So people are not sure. And then the second friction point is around what's the kind of community, what are the resources that I can rely on. Um, uh, this is obviously a cost question also, because even if some of this might be open source, you need to find some resources to land it. So who can I rely on? What are my development philanthropic partners, technical partners? So we need to kind of build this community. So community building around DPIs, where again we don't have silos. DPG silo, open source silo. So we've been thinking collectively about DPIs, DPGs, and OS, but then on the ground, I find that as another. And then, frankly, I think it's a public officials' capacity issue as well. So, where I mean, public officials struggle with, I want to leverage the digital transformation, but where do I? What kind of human resource? What kind of investment roadmap, legislation, etc.
So if I can just break that down further, so you've got trust, you've got capacity. Foreign Secretary, I think the last 2 minutes of his speech was all about trust, resilience, safe. The G20 had some documentation. There's a robust process on with the safeguards, DPI safeguards process that you're overseeing through the GDC at the UN. I think it's in its second year now. And that's a very important process in itself. And it seems to be that trust is key. So when you talk to countries from around the world, whether it's a big ocean state or it's a country of a population of less than, say, 25 million, I think for them it seems to be, how do we trust the code? How do we trust the financing? And where does this governance fit in to all of this? So how do we trust the fact that this is going to be sustainable down the line? If a DPG goes out of business, do we go out of business? So how do we put all of this together? And if I can be somewhat, is there a requirement to create something like a collective trust framework that goes beyond the UN, includes DPGs, open source communities, financiers, markets? And is that too big an ambition in this time of geopolitical disarray?
I think we have the trust framework. The GDC has this vision, it's principles based, but there are concrete commitments in 5 areas. These are kind of interlocking areas, and time tested principles and frameworks are the bedrock there. And then within that, we have the DPI safeguards framework, which has been universally acclaimed. And it is essential to trust, which you pointed out as the key dimension of DPI implementation. I think what we need, frankly, is to take it to the world. So it's the hard job of implementing, and avoiding silos while doing that. So one of our priorities for 2025 on the DPI safeguards framework is taking it to global partners like the World Bank, the ADB, other partners who are working on the ground. So it's not only about the UN, as you implied. It's about a wider ecosystem of international partners, and not only about institutions in the traditional intergovernmental sense, but also philanthropies, other development parties. The second aspect of building trust is that we need wider contributions to the knowledge products around DPIs. I think there's always going to be some hesitation. It was developed in country X, and therefore it's not relevant for me. Maybe there's something in there that may not, maybe weaponize in the future. So, a collective discovery of DPIs, landing it in context where the local communities, the local government can own it up and say, this is ours. And so our focus again in 2025 on Africa, where I think we need, because India, 1.4 billion people, the India stack works beautifully for India. Does it work for Africa? I believe so, but not everyone may believe so. So how does it work in Rwanda, 13 million people, or in Ethiopia, 100 million people? What's the African vision? In India, it was inclusion and bringing everyone into the mainstream of the economy. That was the driving factor. Maybe it's intra-regional trade and lifting incomes up in Africa, something else. So discovery in context is very important for trust.
So it seems to me from kind of general interactions with the open source community that contextual innovation is now at the heart of what they're doing. Maybe if I can take your story further, which is that there's an India story, but frankly, that story may not work for many other countries, right? I mean, we did it a particular way in India, but there are extracts of that story that could work in different ways if you innovate and you partner in itself. You could do stuff on the cloud, you don't need to do it on the ground. And there are many other kind of ways in which the one thing that seems to be is that everyone is banging their heads on is the silo business. Is the open source community or markets will innovate. They'll contextualize when they see a business opportunity. But the silos somehow get in the way of seeing that innovation actually come into practice. And I'll be pretty direct and honest as we've been in conversations with the EU Commission. The general sense I have is EU Commission's view is we want our own DPI. Once we have our own DPI, then we're comfortable of working with anyone else in Africa. You talk to people, it's in Singapore, I've got an Asia story. In LATAM, there's a Brazil story. So how do we, and this comes to the heart of politics in the UN, I don't think, it seems that you can't break the silos, but how do we do more within some kind of interoperability between the silos?
I think it's a the interplay of what can we do top down and what comes grassroots up to break silos, and it's a constant effort because silos are constantly emerging. There's it's like branching in code. Sorry, putting on my engineer's hat. So people branch off, and then you need gatherings to coax people together, curate conversations. So I see Madhukar is there at the back of the room. So the DPI Summit in Cairo, bringing the community together. We'll have the open source week in June, and 19 June is the DPI day. So making sure that these potential silos kind of, come and bash together in some ways. And I think then the other aspect, again, looking at it from the bottom up, is stronger public sector engagement, which is key to breaking silos in terms of implementation, making sure academics, think tanks, universities, who don't have those kind of commercial agendas, but also the private sector, who, as the Foreign Secretary was saying, needs to build off the DPI. So they are there in the implementation phase as well. I think I had mentioned knowledge resources earlier. I think in terms of silo busting and kind of bringing the world together on DPIs, so those are important. People can see their contribution. Let's say on a leaderboard, that this is coming from this region, this is coming from my region. So there is a kind of a back and forth between the global picture and the local picture.
So maybe I could turn to one question, which is, I think, at the heart of resilience, which is money. It's a tough time for development dollars around the world for a variety of reasons, some ideological, some political, otherwise. But net, it seems like a pretty tough time, and it seems like it's not going to be easy. If we are to build resilient systems in different parts of the universe where there is trust in sustainability, how do we do that? What are the new alliances or compacts? So at some level, at least to me, it seems DPI used to be a philanthropy game, or maybe still is largely a philanthropy game. But it doesn't seem that game is going to see this project through till the end. Is there an importance for a markets game to come in play?
We shouldn't forget the larger picture in difficult times. And the larger picture is the development agenda. Massive development challenges across health, agriculture, education, poverty, the digital divide. And then the second part of the big picture is that digital is a solution in terms of resource scarcity. If you have only $100, digital is going to make that $100 count for perhaps 500 or 700. So I think the community should be making this argument to those who are slashing aid budgets that, be careful about where you cut. You don't want to cut muscle, so, and this is part of the muscle of sustainable development. Certainly, um, I will never hesitate to say that the UN needs to make its effort in terms of reform and efficiency. And the Secretary General has told us that this is the 80th anniversary of the UN. That the UN at 80 is about continuing the reform effort, being more frugal. I mean, I have a small team, and we are constantly struggling for resources. But I tell everyone, think like how frugal teams work in the global south. So all of us in the development community need to be more frugal with resources. And importantly, we need to look for partnerships so that we are not competing for funding. We are working together to build complementarity and having more impact on the ground, which will then make the case for those who are looking at slash and burn on development cooperation that this is self-defeating.
So in a sense, I think Amandeep is the way you framed it is makes is that there's a business case in the development case in itself, and then you just go from there in different ways. But the way you go from there in different ways, if I can just push this point a little bit, is it seems that for the markets, it seems that there is a clear business case. If the markets do their job in the DPI way, you'll have a development case as well because your $100 goes much further. How do we make sure that the markets behave? And that 5 years down the line, we're not sitting over here saying, hey, that's great. Somebody started something in a box that became a proprietary solution, which is what the foreign secretary alluded to, rather than being what all of us have been fussing about for the last decade and a half. So are those rules in the GDC? Are those rules in the safeguards process? How do we enforce those rules in a particular way? And I use that term carefully.
That's everywhere. I mean, we have an effort on data governance that's coming up. A multi-stakeholder group has just been set up. This is coming out of the GDC. There is the AI work on the scientific panel, the policy dialogue, and the capacity building effort. There is the DPI work. So in all these areas, we need to push this. And also, I think we need to be careful again in our articulation of this, that DPIs is not something that governments should be doing, that it's a public sector issue. And frankly, there is a downside to people from governments or intergovernmental organizations speaking too much about DPIs, because at the end of the day, this is about building an inclusive digital economy that works for all of society, that doesn't leave anyone behind. So there, if the private sector sees this as, this is not so much a kind of a bottom line issue, but it's the market at the bottom of the pyramid issue. So it's going to expand our potential, total addressable market, TAM, 5 years down the lane. I think this kind of articulation is important. I always, when I speak with African leaders, etc., I bring it back to the inclusive digital economy and the lessons from the past, where there's a massive focus on mobile connectivity. Let's just connect everyone, and then people realize, we needed fixed broadband networks also if we are to take advantage of the digital economy. So we don't want to repeat those mistakes with DPIs and AIs and data interoperability today.
Let me move to DPI and AI. India is going to be chairing the AI summit sometime at the end of this year or early next year. Is there an opportunity for AI and DPI in the way we frame this global summit to take this project further?
Absolutely. And I think the timing is beautiful. President Macron did a great job at the Paris AI Summit of inviting more countries in and opening up the lens. There are significant risks, not only long term, but short term, medium term. We have to keep our eyes on them. But there is the issue of missed opportunities. So we need to focus on the opportunities for sustainable development. And each time I come to India, I'm hugely impressed by some of the use cases, big tech, middle tech, small tech. So that opportunity is there. And India can really use this summit to put forward an alternate vision of how AI can work for everyone and how the world can collaborate on AI benefits. There are many, many things to do. Africa today has less than 1% of the global GPUs availability. I think that's a huge bottleneck for innovators, researchers in Africa who have great ideas, who may have great data sets locally, but they can't access the compute even to validate some basic models. So how can we facilitate that? How can we have people collaborate? The open source community, DPG's DPI community, come together to build the gold standard data sets for the future on climate change, resilient agriculture, many other areas. So I think India can catalyze that kind of a global direction with its chairing of the summit. And we are going through a difficult geopolitical phase. I mean, that's a constant these days. India can also bring different countries together onto the same stage and mitigate some of that competition.
So on the one hand, you have AI for dominance, which is the loud language coming out of Paris, and you have AI for inclusion, which ought to be the loud language coming out of India.
Absolutely. You put it better than I could.
And without getting into trouble with dominance, in a sense. But let me just ask you, I think we're 2-3 minutes in. You have a new position at the UN. You have a new office, I think, that came alive in January this year. It's an office called Digital and Emerging Technologies. What does that office do, and how are you looking to galvanize the safeguards process or the GDC process through this new structure within the UN?
So this is an institutional innovation, and I would say this demonstrates the aspiration of a UN fit for purpose that is of value to member states and stakeholders, and that's looking at cutting edge issues. So obviously for ODET, the new Office for Digital and Emerging Technologies, there is the policy aspect supporting member states, their intergovernmental negotiations, say on the modalities of the scientific panel on AI and the global dialogue on AI. The draft resolution was released last night. So that will continue on an ongoing basis. Governments will come together. They'll have concerns on digital emerging technologies. Today it's AI. Tomorrow it may be DLTs, quantum, something else. So we are there to provide that policy backing, typical secretariat support, knowledge function. The other aspect of the mandate is coordination. The UN system has grown very complex, and 40 plus agencies, UNDP, ITU, UNESCO, have digital agendas of their own. So how do we speak as one UN? How do we act as one UN? So it's a challenge, and we have this coordination aspect. And the third, frankly, is a support function, which is not only aimed at the senior leadership, so advising the Secretary General and colleagues across the UN system on how to manage this, but also other stakeholders, thinking about DPIs, thinking about AI's impact on future labor markets or the requirements of AI infrastructure, AI capacity building, essentially pushing the frontier in terms of global digital cooperation.
Last question. It's become somewhat fashionable today to say that the UN is irrelevant. But clearly, the UN seems to be innovating in order to get ahead of the relevance curve, right? But is there something to the irrelevance argument? Is there something to basically, so say, even taking the GDC and the safeguards process, is there something to be said about taking this much wider than the UN architecture, which seems to be, it will be challenging in the current era of disruption, geopolitics, etc. So where would you like to position the UN to get the best out of the UN in this time of change?
I think we have some unique strengths, USPs, that no other organization has. And the foremost among them is values. No one can beat the UN when it comes to the international human rights treaties, how international. We are the repository of international law. So anything related to international law, the SG is the repository. So this is the bedrock, these values, these international obligations. And in a chaotic, competitive world, you need values. Otherwise, it's might is right and, winner takes all. So I think that's our. The second USP is around convening power. No other organization can bring 193 countries together. And I think there again, we need to be aware that bilaterals and minilaterals are the currency of politics today. I have practiced minilaterals and bilaterals for most of my career, so I know their power. So I think multilateral organizations have to be nimble in working with, as in the DPI space, G20, GDC, that interface. And I think the third aspect, and which is partially USP, but partially a challenge, and we need to focus on that at the UN, is that in terms of concrete value add in different areas like health, for example, WHO's role in terms of pandemic surveillance, pandemic prevention, vaccination is essential. However, we need to look at, what is it member states need exactly? Can someone else deliver that? Am I duplicating work that should be done by a CSO or a philanthropic foundation? Do I need to do apps myself? Or should I leave that? I think there we have a lot of work to do in the UN. And I look at crisis as an opportunity. I think, we need to kind of, and my boss certainly believes in that. When he was the High Commissioner for Refugees, the budget went down like this, and he used that opportunity to regroup, to reform, and then there was a bounce back. It's like a V curve. And I certainly look at, there are some areas where, for different reasons, member states have kind of put down mandates that seem to be everlasting. So it's not only the responsibility of the Secretariat to think about these issues. Member states also need to think, I put in this mandate 45 years ago. Is it relevant today? We created this forum 20 years ago. What should be its role today? Should we be shoving everything in there? Should we be looking at something else? So I think there is a reflection to be had, not only in the Secretariat, but among member states and stakeholders on a UN fit for purpose.
Ambassador Gill, thank you so much. You're the special envoy to the Secretary General. If I may, we hope that one day you could be a special envoy for our own office for critical emerging technologies, which is, I think, desperately needed in a country like India. But thank you for spending this time with us.
My pleasure. Thank you, Rudra.